Pauline Wicks hurried along the cobblestones with her shawl drawn around her tightly against the chilly November night air. There was no fog, but it was still dark, and Whitechapel was full of snickets and ginnels, all of them black with shadow, even by daylight. Her eyes scanned those shadows as she went, a habit that was second nature to her. You never knew who might be lurking in there, waiting for the right time to drag you off and do something horrible. It had always been a dangerous place for women, and worse for women like her, even before Jack started ripping. She thought of Mary then, poor Mary, and the things he'd done to her. Thought of how her face must have looked after he'd finished cutting. Pauline hadn't seen the body, and she couldn't read the papers, but there was always talk, and the talk was that Jack had taken his time with Mary Kelly, and turned her into something like you'd see in a butcher's window. Her neck was cut through all the way to her backbone, they said. He'd sliced her skin all over and cut bits of her off, leaving one under her head like a pillow. He'd opened her up and taken her liver and heart, and then, at the end, he'd hacked at her face until it wasn't a face anymore. All this, and not even in some shady alley or forgotten doorway, but in Mary's own room. There were no safe spaces for women like Mary and Pauline. She stopped under one of the few gas streetlights that actually worked and looked around. The streets had gotten quieter of late, but there were always working girls out, hoping to turn a trick in spite of everything that was going on. They still had to eat, after all. She nodded at the other two women across the road, who returned the courtesy. The chill crept into her bones as she stood there for an hour, half relieved and half frustrated that nobody had approached her. Someone might turn up though, she told herself, and she'd do what she had to do. Another hour passed before someone did. She saw him appear out of the fog and into the light down the street as he passed under it, only to vanish back into the dark, then re-emerge a bit closer. He was wearing a deerstalker hat and a long coat with a short cape about the shoulders. His head was down, as if to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. Not unusual for a punter, especially when they were better dressed than some. As he neared, she saw the other women across the road take their leave. By the time he was standing in front of her, they were alone on the street. "What's your pleasure, sir?" she asked him, still managing to make her tone playful in spite of her apprehension. He looked over his shoulder cautiously, and she tensed, but then he raised his head, and she saw his eyes. "You are, my dear," he told her. His voice was gentle, but he sounded just as nervous as she felt. He looked to be about 30, she reckoned. His eyes were big and green, and his demeanour reminded her a little of a child. "Come on then, my love," she said as she took his hand. He hesitated for a moment, then started to walk with her, away from the light, away from safety. They hurried on, further and deeper into the labyrinth of dark little passages and cut-throughs. Pauline led the way, and he seemed happy to take whatever route she took him on, but whenever they came across a working light, he pulled her out of its way, obviously preferring that they remained in the darkness. Like his predilection for keeping his head down as they navigated the streets, it didn't surprise her. Hugging the shadows and throwing sideways glances were common of all punters as they tried to maintain their discretion. But nowadays, such a thing could be a hint, a murderous tell. Did this man intend to fuck her, or cut off her head? Or both? The smell of the river grew stronger as they drew closer to her intended destination. Although she barely noticed the odour herself, she knew it must have smelled bad to those who were unaccustomed to it. The Thames was full of sewage and waste from the factories, and there were always dead dogs and cats floating along top. Her companion visibly gagged before composing himself. No stomach for the smell, she noted. They arrived at a small wooden building, its door slightly ajar, showing only a sliver of the blackness beyond. The flaking paint across the front wall indicated that it had, once, been used for storage, but she knew it had long since been abandoned before it was adopted by working women who preferred not to take their work home. "In we go then," she said. "There are candles inside, somewhere to lie down." He looked over his shoulder again. "Don't worry, my love, it's safe." "What if we are disturbed?" the stranger asked. No danger of that. Us working girls have an arrangement. Tonight this place is mine. Nobody ever comes by. Is it clean? He was eager. His breathing had become heavy. Clean as it can be, sir. Won't you come inside and have a look? She tugged his arm gently, and after a moment he followed, stepping into the blackness after her. She heard the door creak shut behind them. Pauline hurried across the room in the dark, familiar enough with the surroundings to put her hand on the box of matches and light the candle quickly. Aside from the bed, which was just a few blankets gathered in a pile in the middle of the damp floorboards, and the small table with the candles and matches on it, there was nothing else in the room but Pauline and the stranger, whom she now turned to face. He was standing between her and the door, his overcoat now open to reveal a darkly stained apron. The blade of the knife in his right hand glinted in the candlelight. "Oh," she said quietly, not quite believing her eyes. And then she screamed, "It's him! It's the Ripper!" "Call me Jack," he said, advancing slowly. Pauline stumbled on the blankets and reached under them to pull out a small, heavy club. All the girls knew where to find it in case things went bad with a punter. She held it up, ready to strike. "What are you screaming for, Strumpet? You said yourself there's nobody around." All of a sudden, the door burst open behind him and Pauline breathed a hard sigh of relief. The Ripper turned, wide-eyed and shocked to the core. She took the opportunity to swing the club, and it connected viciously with the side of his skull with a crack. He dropped the knife as his knees buckled and he fell forward, a sound escaping him that was halfway between a gasp and a yelp. The first two through the door were Carmela and Hattie, who had been across the road from Pauline when the punter had first approached her under the light half an hour earlier. There followed another 6 working women, all of them in on the trap that had been set 3 times already, but never sprung. For 3 nights past, the punter had turned out to be just that, and the girls had made their money. "Is this the one you did them all with?" asked Hattie as she stepped around his prone form and picked up the knife. It was a wicked-looking thing, sharp for slicing. He was babbling nonsense and his legs jerked spasmodically while he bled from the cut above his ear. "Yes, I think this is the one." "Well, you can have it back. From all of them. From us." She screamed angrily as she plunged the metal down into him and felt it scrape something hard as it went between his shoulder blades. The man on the floor let out a shriek and started to flap pathetically. The others set about him then. Blades and caushes went up and came down, hard, puncturing, cutting, and crushing the life from him. The coward before them wasn't Jack the Ripper anymore. He was all the men who did whatever they wanted to people like Mary Jane Kelly just because they were poor, just because they were women. Soon, sweating and bloodied, they scraped and pushed what was left of him onto the blankets before wrapping it all up, and between them, they trudged the leaking bundle to the edge of the river. Once, twice it swung back and forth before they let go, and the red mess that had been Jack the Ripper sploshed unceremoniously into the black, filthy water of the Thames. They watched the bubbling blankets go under and the truth with them. None of them spoke. Hattie hopped and spat a goodbye. Pauline wasn't the least inclined to say a prayer, but she didn't suppose it would have done him much good even if she had. Some things are just unforgivable, she thought. The women didn't hang around long. It was cold and dark, and even though the streets were that little bit safer now, there were other monsters. There were always other monsters. And there was always more work to do. Life and death would go on.